little girl on the run, a mysterious necklace, and a ruthless organization. It all began on a cold winter night. Hit follow to uncover shocking twists and jaw-dropping truths. A chilly winter evening settled over Oak Street. 15-year-old Jamal Johnson walked home from basketball practice, his favorite ball tucked under his arm. Snow covered the ground, making every step crunch beneath his worn sneakers. "See you tomorrow, coach," he had called out after staying late to help the younger kids practice. Teaching them always made him happy, especially when their faces lit up after making their first basket. The cold wind blew through his thin hoodie, but Jamal didn't mind. Life in this modest neighborhood had taught him to focus on what mattered, like helping others and chasing his dreams on the basketball court. His dark skin glistened with sweat from practice, quickly cooling in the winter air. "Mom's probably wondering where I am," he thought, checking the time. She worked hard as a lawyer, taking extra cases to keep food on the table and the bills paid. Times were tough, but they had each other. Looking ahead, Jamal spotted his usual shortcut through Henderson Park. During summer, the basketball court there was always full of kids playing and laughing. Now it lay quiet under a blanket of snow. The metal hoops stood like silent guardians in the growing darkness. The street lights began flickering on, casting long shadows across the fresh snow. Jamal pulled his hoodie closer and picked up his pace. The sooner he got home, the sooner he could warm up with his mom's hot chocolate, if she wasn't too busy with her case files. Either way, just being home would be enough. As Jamal walked through the park, something caught his eye. Near the old oak tree, a small figure sat hunched on a wooden bench. At first, he thought it might be a pile of clothes someone had left behind. And he saw it move. Walking closer, Jamal realized it was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, and she was shivering in the cold. She wore only a thin pink sweater. No coat, no scarf, no gloves. Snow had started collecting on her brown hair, which hung in messy tangles around her face. "Hey, are you okay?" Jamal called softly, not wanting to frighten her. The girl didn't look up. She kept her head down, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her small body trembled, but Jamal wasn't sure if it was just from the cold. Something about the way she sat, trying to make herself as small as possible, told him she was scared. He noticed other things too. Her clothes were wrinkled and dirty. Her shoes were wet from the snow. When she shifted slightly, he heard her stomach growl. She looked like she hadn't eaten in a while. Jamal took another step closer, moving slowly like he did when approaching the stray cats in his neighborhood. The girl tensed at the sound of his footsteps. She glanced up for just a second, and Jamal caught a glimpse of big blue eyes filled with fear, before she quickly looked away again. The street lamps cast long shadows across the snow, making the scene feel even more eerie. Something wasn't right. No kid should be out alone in this weather, especially not without a coat. Jamal felt his heart squeeze with worry as he watched her shiver in the growing darkness. Jamal set his basketball down in the snow and took another careful step forward. The girl reminded him of a frightened bird, ready to fly away at any sudden movement. "I'm Jamal," he said softly. "I live just a few blocks from here." He waited for a response, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on her shoes. The wind picked up, sending another shiver through her small frame. Jamal remembered the granola bar in his backpack, the one he'd saved for after practice. His stomach growled, but he knew she needed it more than he did. "You must be hungry," he said, slowly reaching into his bag. The girl's eyes darted up at the movement, then quickly back down. He could see her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the bench. "Here," Jamal held out the granola bar. "It's okay, you can take it." For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the whisper of falling snow and the distant hum of traffic. Then, ever so slowly, the girl's hand reached out. Her fingers were red from the cold as they wrapped around the granola bar. She pulled it close to her chest but didn't open it. Instead, she snuck another quick glance at Jamal, as if trying to figure out why he was being nice to her. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "It's chocolate chip. Those are the best kind." Her fingers fumbled with the wrapper, shaking too much to get a good grip. Finally, she managed to tear it open. The smell of chocolate and oats drifted up, and Jamal saw her shoulders relax just a tiny bit. The granola bar wrapper crinkled in the quiet park as Ellie took small, careful bites. Snow continued falling around them, making the world feel soft and muffled. Jamal waited patiently, letting her eat. Finally, her voice came out barely louder than a whisper. "I can't." She paused, hugging herself tighter. "I can't go home." Her words shook, partly from cold and partly from something else. Jamal looked at the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping fast, and her thin sweater wouldn't keep her warm much longer. "Listen," he said gently. "My house isn't far from here. It's warm, and my mom's home. She's really nice. She helps people for a living." Ellie's head shot up, fear flashing across her face. She shook her head quickly, scooting back on the bench. "We have hot chocolate," Jamal added with a small smile. "And my mom always makes too much dinner." Another cold wind swept through the park, making Ellie shiver violently. She looked around, as if searching for another option, but found only empty swings and snow-covered slides. "You'll be safe," Jamal promised, "just until you warm up." Ellie bit her lip, considering. Her hands twisted the granola wrapper back and forth. After what felt like forever, she gave a tiny nod, so small he almost missed it. "Okay," she whispered, the word forming a little cloud in the cold air. They walked slowly through the snowy streets, Jamal matching his steps to Ellie's smaller ones. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light on the white ground, making their shadows stretch long and dark. Every few steps, Ellie would turn her head to look behind them. The first time she did it, Jamal thought she'd heard something. By the fourth time, he knew it wasn't just random. Her small hand gripped the edge of her sweater tightly, knuckles white with tension. A car drove past, its headlights sweeping across them. Ellie jumped, pressing closer to Jamal's side. He pretended not to notice, but kept his basketball ready, somehow feeling better with it in his hands. "We're almost there," he said softly, trying to sound cheerful. "Just 2 more blocks." Ellie nodded, but her eyes darted to a dark alley they passed, then to a parked van, then back over her shoulder again. Something about her fear felt different from just being lost or cold. Jamal wanted to ask what she was looking for or who, but the way she trembled told him now wasn't the time. Instead, he pointed to the lights of his street ahead. "See those Christmas lights on that blue house? That's my neighbor's place. Ours is right next door." But even as he spoke, Ellie checked behind them one more time. Jamal found himself listening more carefully to the night sounds around them. Footsteps in the snow, car engines in the distance, the rustle of winter wind through empty trees. Jamal led Ellie up the walkway to a modest 2-story house with warm yellow light spilling from its windows. His home wasn't fancy, but it had always felt safe, exactly what Ellie needed right now. "This is it," he said softly, fishing his keys from his pocket. The porch light flickered on automatically, making Ellie flinch. She stood close behind him, her small frame still shivering despite their brisk walk. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and paper, signs his mom was working late again. Law books and case files were spread across the dining room table where Mrs. Johnson sat surrounded by her work. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied a document. "Mom?" Jamal called out gently. "I'm home, and I brought someone who needs help." Mrs. Johnson looked up, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the small girl partially hidden behind her son. The lawyer's expression shifted from surprise to concern as she noticed Ellie's thin sweater and trembling hands. "I found her in Henderson Park," Jamal explained quickly. "She was sitting alone in the cold. She hasn't eaten much, and she's freezing." Mrs. Johnson set down her papers and stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Her voice was gentle when she spoke. "Hello there. I'm Sarah Johnson, Jamal's mother." She moved around the table, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. Ellie pressed closer to Jamal, her fingers gripping the edge of his hoodie. Her blue eyes darted between Mrs. Johnson and the door, as if measuring her escape route. "Mom's a lawyer," Jamal added softly. "She helps people who are in trouble. That's why I thought—" He trailed off, looking at his mother with pleading eyes. Mrs. Johnson nodded, understanding flowing between mother and son. She'd raised him to be kind, to help others, but this situation clearly went beyond a simple act of kindness. "You must be very cold," she said to Ellie, her tone warm but professional. "Why don't we get you something hot to drink? Then we can talk about how to help you." Ellie's grip on Jamal's hoodie loosened slightly. She glanced up at him, seeking reassurance. He gave her an encouraging smile, the same one he used with the younger kids at basketball practice. "Okay," he whispered, "my mom's the best at fixing things, promise." The young girl took a small step forward, finally moving out from behind Jamal. In the bright kitchen light, Mrs. Johnson could see just how pale and tired the child looked. Her maternal instincts warred with her legal training. This girl clearly needed help, but there would be protocols to follow, questions to ask. For now, though, she simply pulled out a kitchen chair and reached for the kettle. Sometimes, she knew, help started with something as simple as a warm drink and a safe place to sit. Steam rose from the mug of hot chocolate as Mrs. Johnson placed it carefully in front of Ellie. The girl's small hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, but her eyes remained fixed on the table's surface. "Can you tell me why you were in the park alone?" Mrs. Johnson kept her voice soft, professional yet kind. "We want to help, but we need to understand what's happening." Ellie's fingers tightened around the mug. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm running away." She paused, swallowing hard. "I have to hide." Mrs. Johnson exchanged a quick glance with Jamal, who hovered nearby, worry etched on his young face. As a lawyer, she'd seen enough cases to know when something wasn't right. But as a mother, she also recognized genuine fear in a child's eyes. "Running from what, sweetheart?" She leaned forward slightly. "Or from whom?" Ellie shook her head quickly, her tangled hair falling forward to hide her face. Her shoulders tensed, and she seemed to curl even smaller in the kitchen chair. "I can't." Mrs. Johnson sat back, her legal mind working through the implications. Taking in an unknown child could be complicated, possibly even dangerous. But sending her back out into the cold night seemed unthinkable. "Mom," Jamal spoke up softly, "we can't just make her leave." Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. "One night," she decided. "You can stay here tonight, Ellie. We'll figure things out in the morning." Relief flooded the girl's face, though fear still lingered in her eyes. Mrs. Johnson stood, her mind already planning next steps. "Jamal, grab some of your old clothes from the storage box upstairs. They'll be big, but they'll be warm." She turned to the refrigerator. "I'll heat up some soup. When did you last eat properly, Ellie?" The girl shrugged, still staring into her hot chocolate. "Yesterday, maybe? I'm not sure." While Jamal bounded upstairs, Mrs. Johnson worked quickly in the kitchen. Soon, the smell of warming chicken soup filled the air. She pulled out bread, cheese, and fruit, simple foods that wouldn't overwhelm an empty stomach. Ellie ate slowly, carefully, like someone who wasn't sure when their next meal would come. Mrs. Johnson noticed how the girl's eyes darted to the windows whenever a car passed outside, how she flinched at unexpected sounds. Jamal returned with a small pile of clothes, old sweatpants, a thick sweater, warm socks. "They'll be super big," he said with an encouraging smile. "But they're really cozy." For the first time that evening, Ellie's lips curved into a tiny smile. It was brief, but it was there, a small crack in her wall of fear. The kitchen clock ticked softly as Ellie took another tiny spoonful of soup. Her movements were careful, measured, like a small animal ready to flee at any moment. The warm food should have been comforting, but her eyes kept drifting to the kitchen window, scanning the darkness outside. A car's headlights swept across the glass, making shadows dance on the wall. Ellie's spoon clattered against the bowl as she tensed, her breath catching in her throat. "It's just the neighbors coming home," Mrs. Johnson said quietly. She slid the curtains closed with a gentle movement. "No one knows you're here, Ellie. You're safe." The girl's shoulders remained tight, her soup barely touched, despite having eaten only a granola bar all day. Mrs. Johnson pulled up a chair beside her, keeping a careful distance. "You know," she said softly, "part of my job is helping people who are scared, people who need someone to listen." She paused, watching Ellie's face. "Sometimes sharing what scares us makes it feel a little less frightening." Ellie stared into her bowl, stirring the soup slowly. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "My dad, he had a job, a special job." Her fingers twisted in the oversized sweater she now wore. "He never told me what it was, but he always said it was important to keep secrets." Mrs. Johnson nodded encouragingly while Jamal sat quietly at the far end of the table, trying not to startle the nervous girl. "He would come home late sometimes," Ellie continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He'd check all the windows and doors, and he'd tell me, 'Remember, Ellie, some things have to stay just between us.'" Another car passed outside. This time, Ellie's eyes snapped to the front door, her small body coiling with tension. "Did something happen to your dad?" Mrs. Johnson asked gently. Ellie's lower lip quivered. She swallowed hard. "He told me to run, to hide. He said they might come looking, but I couldn't let them find me." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't even know who they are." Mrs. Johnson reached out slowly, placing her hand on the table, palm up, an offer of comfort without pressure. After a long moment, Ellie's small fingers crept across the table and rested lightly on her hand. "You did the right thing coming with Jamal," Mrs. Johnson said softly. "Whatever's happening, we'll figure it out together. Right now, you just need to focus on eating a little more soup. Can you do that for me?" Ellie nodded, picking up her spoon again. Though her eyes still darted to the window occasionally, her shoulders had relaxed just slightly. In the warm kitchen light, surrounded by the quiet presence of Jamal and his mother, she took another small spoonful of soup. Ellie's hand moved to her neck, fingers wrapping around something beneath the borrowed sweater. With hesitant movements, she pulled out a simple silver chain. A small pendant hung from it, catching the kitchen light. "Dad gave me this," she whispered, her voice growing thick with emotion. "The night he..." She paused, blinking rapidly. "The night he disappeared. He said I had to keep it safe no matter what." Mrs. Johnson leaned closer, studying the pendant. It looked ordinary enough, a small silver disc with some kind of pattern etched into its surface. But something about the way Ellie held it, like it carried the weight of the world, made it seem far more significant. He poured it around my neck himself, Ellie continued, her fingers tracing the pattern. He said, "Don't let anyone take this from you, sweetheart, not for any reason." Then he, her voice cracked. Then he hugged me and left. I haven't seen him since. Later, after settling Ellie in the guest room, Mrs. Johnson pulled Jamal aside in the hallway. The house was quiet now, but tension hung in the air like a heavy blanket. "Jamal," she whispered, her face serious, "no one can know Ellie is here. Not your friends, not your teachers, no one. Do you understand?" Jamal nodded, though questions burned in his mind. "But Mom, what about—" "No one," she repeated firmly. "Whatever Ellie's involved in, whatever that necklace means, someone's looking for her. We need to keep her safe." "I won't tell anyone," Jamal promised, but as he headed to his room, worry gnawed at his stomach. What kind of trouble could make a father abandon his daughter? What secrets could a simple necklace hold? In his bedroom, Jamal sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the quiet house. He could hear the soft hum of the heating system, the occasional creak of old floorboards, and was that a car slowing down outside? He moved to his window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The street looked normal enough, peaceful under its blanket of snow. But something felt different now, as if the familiar neighborhood held hidden dangers he'd never noticed before. Jamal thought of Ellie's fearful eyes, the way she clutched her necklace, her father's mysterious warning. He'd wanted to help someone in need, but now he wondered if he'd drawn his family into something much bigger and much more dangerous than he could have imagined. Sleep would be hard to find tonight, he knew. Too many questions, too many worries. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't let anything happen to Ellie. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. The kitchen had grown quiet except for the gentle hum of the dishwasher. Ellie sat curled in her chair, the oversized sweater making her look even smaller than she was. Mrs. Johnson was about to suggest bedtime when Ellie's voice broke the silence. "Mom used to make soup, too," she whispered. Then, without warning, tears began streaming down her face. Her small shoulders shook as she tried to hold back sobs. "Oh, sweetheart." Mrs. Johnson moved closer, but stopped short of touching her. Some hurts ran too deep for casual comfort. Jamal watched helplessly as Ellie pressed her hands against her face, muffling her cries. When she finally spoke again, her words came out broken and raw. "I miss them. I miss them so much." Mrs. Johnson exchanged a worried glance with Jamal. There was more to this story, much more. The girl's tears spoke of loss deeper than temporary separation. "Ellie," Mrs. Johnson said gently, "we need to know what happened to help you, your parents." But Ellie just shook her head violently, her tangled hair swaying. Fresh tears fell onto the borrowed sweater as she hugged herself tightly. Whatever secrets she carried seemed too painful to share. Mrs. Johnson stood up slowly, her legal mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. A missing father, a mysterious necklace, a terrified child. The pieces didn't add up to anything pleasant. "Jamal," she said quietly, "go upstairs and prepare the guest room." Then she turned to Ellie, her voice firm but kind. "You'll stay inside tomorrow. No school, no going out, not until we understand what's happening." "But what about basketball practice?" Jamal asked, though he already knew the answer. "You'll stay home too." Mrs. Johnson's tone left no room for argument. "Until we know who might be watching, we can't risk drawing attention to this house or to Ellie." Ellie looked up, her face tear-stained but grateful. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry for causing trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Mrs. Johnson assured her, finally reaching out to smooth the girl's messy hair. "You're in trouble. There's a difference." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering their tracks from earlier. Mrs. Johnson watched the white flakes swirl in the darkness, wondering what tomorrow would bring. One thing was certain: their quiet life had just become considerably more complicated. But as she watched Ellie's exhausted face, still marked with tears, she knew they'd made the right choice. Whatever storm this child was running from, she wouldn't face it alone anymore. Morning sunlight glinted off the fresh snow when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the Johnson house. Mrs. Johnson, who had been reviewing case files at the kitchen table, froze mid-sip of her coffee. Through the frosted glass panels of the front door, she could make out a tall figure in a dark suit. Another knock, somehow more insistent this time. "Just a moment," she called out, quickly gesturing for Jamal to take Ellie upstairs. They had been eating breakfast, but now both children moved silently away from the table, understanding the urgency in her eyes. Mrs. Johnson straightened her sweater and approached the door. The man she found on her doorstep was impeccably dressed in a black suit and tie. His smile seemed practiced, too perfect. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," he said smoothly. "I apologize for the early visit, but I'm here about my niece, Ellie Harper." Mrs. Johnson's lawyer instincts kicked in immediately. She kept her expression neutral, even as her heart began racing. I'm sorry, who did you say you were?" "Thomas Harper," he replied, adjusting his silver watch. "David Harper's brother. We've been searching for Ellie since yesterday evening. Her father asked me to collect her." "That's interesting," Mrs. Johnson said carefully. "And you have documentation to prove this relationship?" The man's smile flickered slightly. "Ma'am, keeping a minor from their legal guardian is a serious offense. I'm trying to handle this situation amicably." Mrs. Johnson squared her shoulders, her voice taking on the steel she used in courtrooms. "Then you'll understand why I need to see proper documentation. Custody papers, identification, proof of your relationship with Ellie's father." "I seem to have left those documents in my car," he said, his smile now strained. "I could retrieve them, but perhaps it would be simpler if you just brought Ellie out now." "No documentation, no discussion," Mrs. Johnson stated firmly. "As a lawyer, I'm sure you understand the legal requirements for transferring custody of a minor." A shadow passed over the man's face, his practiced charm slipping for just a moment. In that brief instant, Mrs. Johnson caught a glimpse of something cold and dangerous in his eyes. Upstairs, hidden in the hallway, Ellie pressed herself against the wall, trembling. Jamal stood protectively beside her, both listening to the exchange below. Through the window, they could see a black car idling across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. The man's polite facade cracked slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Mrs. Johnson, surely we can resolve this like reasonable people. The documents are merely a formality." "A necessary formality," Mrs. Johnson replied, her hand firm on the doorframe. Years of courtroom experience steadied her voice. "Without proper documentation, this conversation is over." "Think carefully about your position here." His tone dropped lower, honey turning to ice. "You're harboring someone else's child. That could be problematic for a lawyer's career." Mrs. Johnson's spine stiffened. "Is that a threat, Mr. Harper?" "Simply an observation." His smile returned, cold and sharp as winter frost. "Children should be with their families. I'm sure you'll come to understand that soon enough." "Leave my property now," Mrs. Johnson commanded. "Any further communication can go through proper legal channels." The man stepped back, straightening his suit jacket. "Very well. But remember, some doors once opened can't be easily closed." His gaze shifted past her, scanning the house's windows. "We'll be in touch." Mrs. Johnson shut the door firmly, engaging every lock. Through the glass, she watched him walk unhurriedly to the black car waiting across the street. Only when the vehicle pulled away did she release her held breath. Upstairs, she found Ellie huddled in the corner of the hallway, Jamal standing protectively nearby. The girl's face had gone pale as paper, her hands clutching her necklace so tightly her knuckles were white. "That's them?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling like autumn leaves. "They found me, just like Dad said they would." Her eyes filled with tears. "He's not my uncle. We don't have any family left." Mrs. Johnson knelt beside her, keeping her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Listen to me, Ellie. They won't get to you, not while you're under my roof." But even as she spoke the words, she glanced out the window where the black car had been. The fresh snow showed tire tracks leading away, dark lines cutting through the white powder, a reminder that their peaceful morning had shattered into something far more dangerous. Jamal moved closer to Ellie, his young face set with determination. "Mom's right. We won't let them take you." Mrs. Johnson watched her son protect this frightened girl, pride mixing with worry in her heart. They'd stepped into something dark here, something that went far beyond a simple case of a lost child. The question was, how deep did this mystery go? And what would it cost them to uncover the truth? After the man's visit, Jamal sat with Ellie in the living room while his mother made phone calls from her study. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, creating warm patches on the carpet, but Ellie still trembled. "Hey," Jamal said softly, pulling a blanket from the couch and draping it over her shoulders. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. Mom's really good at helping people. It's kind of her superpower." Ellie managed a tiny smile, clutching the blanket tight. "You're not scared?" "Maybe a little," Jamal admitted. "But being scared doesn't mean we can't be brave too." In her study, Mrs. Johnson spoke quietly into her phone. "Robert, I need your expertise on this. Something's very wrong here." She described the mysterious man, his threatening behavior, the black car. "Can you look into it?" Quietly. Detective Wells, an old colleague, agreed to start investigating immediately. When Mrs. Johnson returned to the living room, she found Ellie looking slightly calmer. The girl's fingers still played with her necklace, but her breathing had steadied. "My dad," Ellie started, then paused, gathering courage. "He used to work normal jobs, construction, delivery drivers, things like that. Then someone offered him special work, good money." Her voice dropped. "But it changed him. He started staying up late, making phone calls when he thought I was sleeping." Mrs. Johnson sat down slowly, careful not to interrupt the flow of words. "One night, I heard him crying," Ellie continued. "He was looking at old photos of us, saying he was sorry over and over." She swallowed hard. "The next day, he gave me this necklace." Jamal leaned forward slightly as Ellie's hand tightened around the silver pendant. He said, "Ellie, if they ever come looking, you keep this safe. Don't let anyone take it no matter what they say." Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "It's the key to making things right," he told me. "But I don't understand what he meant." Mrs. Johnson watched the girl carefully, her legal mind piecing together fragments of a larger puzzle. Whatever Ellie's father had gotten involved in, it was serious enough to make him fear for his daughter's safety. "We'll figure it out," she promised, her voice firm. "Detective Wells is very good at finding answers. For now, you just focus on staying safe." Ellie nodded, her small fingers tracing the pattern on her necklace. In the quiet room, surrounded by her protectors, she finally allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Detective Wells moved through Henderson Park like a casual walker, his experienced eyes scanning the area where Jamal had found Ellie. His camera, disguised as an old tourist model, captured images of footprints in the remaining snow, the bench, and surrounding buildings. Back at the Johnson house, Jamal stood at his bedroom window, homework forgotten on his desk. A silver sedan had been parked across the street for 2 hours now. Different from yesterday's black car, but somehow just as threatening. "Mom," he called, softly, not wanting Ellie to hear. "There's another one." Mrs. Johnson appeared beside him, her face tightening as she observed the car. Without a word, she made another call to the security company. Within an hour, technicians arrived to install additional cameras and motion sensors around the property. "Just some routine upgrades," Mrs. Johnson explained to the curious neighbors, her smile masking her concern. That evening, as they sat in the newly secured living room, Ellie's voice broke the quiet. "Dad used to talk about them sometimes, when he thought I couldn't hear." "About who, sweetie?" Mrs. Johnson asked, setting down her legal papers. "The dangerous people." Ellie hugged her knees to her chest. "He said they wore nice suits and drove expensive cars, but they were like wolves in sheep's clothing." Jamal moved closer to the window, checking the street again. The silver sedan was gone, replaced by a dark SUV. "He said they can make people disappear," Ellie continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Not like magic, like something worse. And once they chose you, they'd never let go." The security system beeped softly, acknowledging a motion trigger in the backyard. Mrs. Johnson checked the new camera feed on her tablet, just a neighborhood cat, but her hand still shook slightly as she set the device down. Detective Wells's message appeared on her phone. "Found multiple sets of prints at the park. Professional surveillance equipment hidden in trees. This is bigger than we thought." Mrs. Johnson looked at Jamal watching the street, at Ellie clutching her necklace, at the new cameras blinking silently in the corners. Their home had become a fortress, but would it be enough to keep the wolves at bay? Ellie sat cross-legged on the couch, holding her necklace up to the afternoon light. The silver pendant spun slowly, revealing strange marks etched into its surface. "I don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than the others. "Why would they want this so badly? It's just a necklace." But even as she spoke, her fingers traced the mysterious patterns her father had shown her how to recognize. Mrs. Johnson's phone buzzed with a message from Detective Wells. Her face grew serious as she read it. "The man who came here," she said carefully, "he's connected to an organization that operates in the shadows. They're involved in things that—" She paused, glancing at the children. "Things that aren't legal." Jamal moved closer to Ellie, protective instinct kicking in. "What kind of things?" Before Mrs. Johnson could answer, Ellie spoke up. "Dad used to draw symbols like these." She pointed to the marks on her necklace. "He'd make me memorize them, like a game. This one looks like a key, and this one," she squinted, "maybe numbers? But he never told me what they meant." Detective Wells's next message was more urgent. "Organization has connections to high-level criminal activities, multiple shell companies, international operations, need police backup." Mrs. Johnson was already dialing the local police chief, an old friend from her early law career. "Tom, I need a favor. We have a situation that requires discreet surveillance. Yes, it's related to that organization you've been tracking." Ellie's hands trembled as she continued studying the necklace. "Sometimes Dad would wake me up in the middle of the night to practice the symbols. He said one day they might be very important." Her voice cracked. I think that's why they're looking for me. They know I can read them." Mrs. Johnson ended her call, relief softening her features slightly. "The police will maintain a subtle presence in the neighborhood. Unmarked cars, plainclothes officers." "Like the ones outside now?" Jamal asked, pointing through the window at two men walking dogs, their alert postures betraying their true purpose. The evening shadows grew longer as they watched the street, each lost in thought. The necklace caught the last rays of sunlight, its symbols seeming to shimmer with untold secrets. Whatever message Ellie's father had hidden there, it was valuable enough to turn their quiet life into a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Detective Wells arrived at the Johnson house early that morning, his weathered face grave as he spread photographs and documents across the kitchen table. Steam rose from his untouched coffee as he pointed to various images. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly, glancing at the children in the next room, "that man who came to your door, he's not who he claims to be. He slid a photograph forward, showing their visitor entering a sleek office building. He's part of an organization that operates in the shadows, dealing in things that aren't exactly legal. Mrs. Johnson studied the image, her lawyer's mind cataloging details. What kind of organization? The dangerous kind. Wells pulled out another document, heavily redacted. They conduct secret transactions across borders, money disappearing into shell companies, mysterious shipments, people who ask too many questions, vanishing without a trace. Ellie, who had crept closer to listen, suddenly gasped. Her small hand flew to her necklace as she stared at a symbol printed in the corner of one document. "What is it, sweetheart?" Mrs. Johnson asked, noticing the girl's pale face. With trembling fingers, Ellie pulled out her necklace. There, etched into the silver pendant, was the same intricate symbol that appeared on the document. "Dad," Ellie's voice quavered, "he made me memorize this symbol, said it was important." Her blue eyes filled with tears. "I thought he just liked the pattern." Mrs. Johnson exchanged a significant look with Detective Wells. The necklace wasn't just a father's parting gift. It was something more, something valuable enough to make dangerous people hunt down a little girl. "Ellie," Wells said gently, "did your father teach you any other symbols? Maybe show you special papers or documents?" The girl nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the pattern on her pendant. "Lots of them. He'd wake me up at night sometimes to practice, said I had to remember them perfectly." Jamal, who had been quietly listening, moved closer to Ellie. "That's why they want the necklace, isn't it? It's not just jewelry." Mrs. Johnson felt a chill run down her spine as she watched Ellie clutch the pendant. The simple silver chain had suddenly become something far more dangerous, a key to secrets that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. "We need to be very careful now," she said, gathering the documents quickly as a car slowed outside their house. "Detective, what's our next move?" Wells peered through the curtains, his expression grim. "We need to find out what these symbols mean, but more importantly, we need to figure out how deep this goes, and how to keep everyone safe while we do it." The morning light caught Ellie's necklace, making the mysterious symbol gleam. What had her father gotten involved in? And what secrets had he hidden in plain sight, hanging around his daughter's neck? Detective Wells spread a city map across the kitchen table, his finger landing on an industrial area near the river. "There's an old warehouse here," he said, tapping the location. "My sources say the organization uses it for their transactions." Ellie, who had been quietly coloring nearby, suddenly looked up. Her crayon clattered to the floor as her eyes widened with recognition. "I know that place," she whispered, moving closer to the map. "Dad used to talk about a building by the river. He said it was where important things happened." Her small fingers traced the waterfront. "He made me memorize the route, just in case." Mrs. Johnson exchanged concerned glances with Detective Wells. "Ellie, honey, what exactly did your father tell you about this building?" "He said if anything ever happened to him, I should remember the warehouse with the blue door." Ellie's voice trembled slightly. "There's a symbol painted above it, like the one on my necklace." Detective Wells pulled out his phone, quickly arranging backup. "I can have plainclothes officers in position within the hour. We should move soon, before they realize we know about this location." "Is it safe to bring Ellie?" Jamal asked, protective instinct kicking in. He stood closer to the young girl, who was still staring at the map. "Safer than leaving her here alone," Mrs. Johnson replied grimly. "We'll stay in the car with a police escort while Detective Wells and his team check the building." As they prepared to leave, Ellie clutched her necklace tightly. Dad said there were secrets hidden there, important ones. She looked up at Mrs. Johnson with worried eyes. What if the bad people are waiting?
"That's why we bring backup," Detective Wells assured her, checking his weapon discreetly. "2 patrol cars will follow at a distance. We'll have eyes on every corner."
They loaded into Mrs. Johnson's car with Jamal keeping Ellie between himself and his mother in the back seat. Detective Wells drove, his experienced eyes scanning for any vehicles that might be following them. The warehouse district loomed ahead, a maze of abandoned buildings and rusty metal. The winter sun cast long shadows between the structures, making every alley seem darker and more threatening. "There," Ellie pointed suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. "The blue door." The warehouse stood silent and seemingly empty, its faded blue door like a beacon against the gray concrete. Above it, barely visible in the weak sunlight, was a familiar symbol, one that matched the delicate etching on Ellie's necklace. The police team moved silently through the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the dusty air. Ellie stood between Mrs. Johnson and Jamal, her small hand gripping her necklace as she studied the walls. "Wait!" she whispered suddenly, pointing to a faded marking near a stack of old crates. "That's one of Dad's symbols. He taught me what it means." Her fingers traced the air, following the pattern. "It marks something hidden." Detective Wells directed his flashlight where she pointed. "The wall looks solid," he murmured, running his hand over the rough concrete. "No," Ellie moved forward eagerly. "Dad showed me. You have to look for the small marks, like a puzzle." Her eyes scanned the wall carefully. "There, see those tiny scratches? They make another symbol." The detective examined the scratches more closely. To everyone's surprise, a section of the wall shifted under his touch, revealing a narrow compartment built into the concrete. "Stand back," he ordered, reaching carefully into the dark space. He pulled out a stack of files, their pages yellow with age. As he spread them on a nearby table, Mrs. Johnson gasped. The documents detailed countless illegal transactions, money transfers, shipment routes, coded messages. "Here," Ellie's voice cracked as she pointed to a familiar name. "That's Dad's handwriting." Her hands trembled as she pulled a paper from the stack. "He wrote these numbers. I recognize how he makes his sevens." Mrs. Johnson wrapped an arm around Ellie's shoulders as they read together. The documents showed David Harper had been tracking the organization's activities, making detailed notes about their operations. "Look at the dates," Detective Wells said quietly. "When Dad disappeared," Ellie finished, her voice small. She traced her father's handwriting with a gentle finger. "But there's nothing here that says where he went." Jamal moved closer, trying to comfort his friend. "Maybe there are more clues in the other papers?" They continued searching through the files, each page revealing more about the organization's dark activities. But of David Harper's fate, they found only questions, no answers. "He was investigating them," Mrs. Johnson realized, studying a particularly detailed note. "Your father wasn't working for them, Ellie. He was trying to expose them." Fresh tears rolled down Ellie's cheeks as she clutched another page covered in her father's familiar script. "But if he was the good guy," she whispered, "why did he have to leave me?" The warehouse creaked around them, its shadows holding more secrets than answers. Somewhere in these documents lay the truth about David Harper's disappearance, and perhaps the key to finding him alive. A sharp crash echoed through the warehouse as the front door burst open. Dark figures poured in, their footsteps thundering against the concrete floor. Detective Wells immediately pushed the children behind some crates. "Mrs. Johnson, get them to the back exit," he whispered urgently, drawing his weapon. "Now!" "The files belong to us," a cold voice called out. Men in dark suits emerged from the shadows, blocking their escape routes. "Hand them over, and no one needs to get hurt." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her lawyer's voice steady despite her racing heart. "These are evidence in an ongoing investigation. You're interfering with police business." "Police business?" The leader laughed darkly. "This is far beyond local law enforcement, Mrs. Johnson." While she kept them talking, Jamal noticed a gap between the crates leading to a side door. He gripped Ellie's hand tightly, whispering, "When I say run, stay close to me." One of the men moved suddenly, lunging for the files. Detective Wells responded instantly, his warning shot echoing off the walls. Chaos erupted as more men rushed forward. "Run!" Jamal pulled Ellie through the gap, ducking under a grabbing hand. They weaved between boxes and old machinery, their footsteps drowned out by the commotion behind them. A shout rang out. One of the men had spotted them. Heavy footsteps pounded after them as they raced through the maze of crates. Jamal's basketball training kicked in as he dodged and weaved, keeping Ellie close. "This way!" He spotted a small crawl space beneath some shelving. They squeezed through just as their pursuer rounded the corner. The man's frustrated curse echoed above them as they shimmed deeper into the shadows. He didn't. Fashioning a flashlight and leading the way down the corridor, he shone his flashlight in the faces of the resulting pair. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The sound of approaching police cars sent the men scrambling. Their pursuers' footsteps retreated, leaving only the sound of Ellie's frightened breathing in the darkness. "It's okay," Jamal whispered, still holding her hand. "Help is coming. Just stay quiet." The warehouse filled with shouts and the sound of running feet as police officers flooded in. Through gaps in the shelving, they could see their attackers fleeing through various exits, disappearing into the maze of industrial buildings. "Jamal? Ellie?" Mrs. Johnson's worried voice called out. "It's safe now. Come out, sweetheart." They crawled from their hiding place, dusty but unharmed. Ellie threw herself into Mrs. Johnson's arms while Jamal scanned the warehouse, making sure all the men in suits were truly gone. Police cars surrounded the warehouse, their lights flashing against the gray walls. Officers led several men in handcuffs to waiting patrol cars, but Detective Wells shook his head in frustration. "The leader got away," he reported to Mrs. Johnson. "Slipped out through a back alley before we could set up a full perimeter." Inside, other officers carefully collected the scattered documents. Ellie sat at a makeshift table, helping sort through papers she could recognize from her father's handwriting. Suddenly, she froze. "Mrs. Johnson?" she called out softly, her finger pointing to an address scrawled in the margin. "Dad used to talk about this place. He said something big was happening there." Detective Wells examined the page. "It's an abandoned factory near the state border. According to these notes, they're planning a major transaction there next week." He studied the details carefully. "Your father's handwriting is all over these plans, Ellie." "Does that mean—" Ellie's voice trembled with hope. "Could he be there?" Mrs. Johnson shared a meaningful look with the detective. "The timing of his disappearance matches these plans," she said carefully. "It's possible he was investigating this transaction when he vanished." Jamal squeezed Ellie's shoulder supportively as she traced her father's familiar handwriting. Detective Wells was already on his phone, coordinating with other units to investigate the location. "If your father is connected to this transaction," he said gently to Ellie, "this might be our chance to find him." The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the warehouse windows. They had found more than just documents. They had found hope and possibly a path to answers about David Harper's disappearance. Detective Wells spread a detailed map across the kitchen table at the Johnson house. Red marks highlighted the route to the abandoned factory, winding through dense forest near the state line. "The transaction is scheduled for tomorrow night," he explained, tracing the path with his finger. "We'll have teams positioned here, here, and here." He marked several spots around the perimeter. Mrs. Johnson studied the plan, her lawyer's mind analyzing every detail. What about Ellie? She should stay somewhere safe. "No!" Ellie's small voice rang out firmly. She stood in the doorway, still clutching her necklace. "Please, I need to be there. What if Dad's trying to find me too?" Jamal moved to stand beside her. "She might recognize something important," he added. "Things the rest of us might miss." Detective Wells nodded slowly. "She'll stay in a secure vehicle with Mrs. Johnson, half a mile from the site. Close enough if we need her help identifying anything, but far enough to stay safe." The forest location appeared on satellite images he pulled up on his tablet. The old factory sat alone, surrounded by thick trees and crumbling access roads, perfect for secret meetings, and perfect for ambushes. "It's so isolated," Mrs. Johnson murmured, concern etching her features. "That's why they chose it," Wells replied. "But it also means they can't easily escape. We'll have every route covered." Ellie studied the images intently, her face a mix of fear and determination. "Dad used to go camping in forests like this," she whispered. "He taught me about following trails and finding north without a compass." "You're very brave, Ellie," Mrs. Johnson said softly, pulling the girl close. "But you have to promise to stay in the car with me, no matter what happens." The young girl nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the factory images. "Do you think he'll be there?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Detective Wells chose his words carefully. "If he's not there physically, we might find information about where he is. Either way, we're getting closer to answers." As night fell, they finalized the details. Police units would move into position before dawn, using the forest cover for concealment. Mrs. Johnson's car would be parked on a hidden service road, with armed officers nearby. Ellie sat quietly through the planning, her fingers tracing the familiar symbols on her necklace. Tomorrow might bring her closer to her father, or at least closer to understanding why he had to leave her behind. Dawn painted the sky in pale grays as police teams took their positions around the old factory. Detective Wells coordinated movements through his radio, his voice barely above a whisper. "Team A, secure the perimeter. Team B, prepare to move in." In the surveillance van parked on the hidden service road, Mrs. Johnson watched the monitors with Ellie and Jamal. The morning mist clung to the trees, making the factory look like something from a dream. "I should be out there with Ellie," Jamal protested quietly. "What if she needs me?" "It's too dangerous," Mrs. Johnson replied firmly. "We need to stay." "Look!" Ellie suddenly pressed her face against the van's window. "Stop the car!" Detective Wells, who was about to leave for his position, paused. "What is it?" Ellie's finger trembled as she pointed to a faded mark on a nearby tree. "That's one of Dad's symbols, the one that means safe path." Her voice quivered with excitement. "He was here!" Through binoculars, they could see more marks on other trees, subtle scratches that would look natural to anyone who didn't know better. Ellie's eyes lit up with recognition. "Dad taught me these. They're like breadcrumbs, showing the safe way in." She turned to Detective Wells, her face pleading. "I can help guide your team. Please?" "Absolutely not," Mrs. Johnson started, but Jamal interrupted. "Then let me go with her. I'll keep her safe." His young face was set with determination. "We'll stay with Detective Wells the whole time." The detective considered for a long moment, looking at the symbols only Ellie could read. Finally, he nodded. "They stay behind me at all times. First sign of trouble, they come straight back here." Mrs. Johnson wanted to protest, but she saw the resolve in both children's faces. These symbols might be their best chance at finding David Harper. "Promise me," she said firmly, gripping Jamal's shoulder. "At the first sign of danger." "We'll run straight back," he assured her. "I won't let anything happen to Ellie." Ellie hugged Mrs. Johnson quickly, then joined Jamal and Detective Wells. As they carefully followed the marked trees, she whispered, "Dad was leaving these for someone to find. He knew someone would come looking." The morning mist swirled around their feet as they moved deeper into the forest, following David Harper's hidden trail toward whatever secrets the old factory held. Through the thermal imaging camera, Detective Wells spotted movement in a small outbuilding behind the factory. "There's someone in there," he whispered. "Not moving much, could be restrained." Ellie's hand tightened around her necklace as she peered at the screen. Another of her father's symbols was scratched near the building's door. "That's Dad's mark," she breathed. "The one he uses to say he's nearby." Before they could move closer, a shout rang out from the factory. "Intruders! Eastern perimeter!" Everything happened at once. Men in dark suits emerged from the building, weapons drawn. Police officers broke cover, shouting commands. The morning air shattered with the sound of gunfire. "Get down!" Detective Wells pushed the children behind a concrete barrier. Radio chatter crackled with urgent voices as the shootout intensified. "We have to reach that building," Wells said between bursts of gunfire. "Your father's in there, Ellie." Through gaps in the barrier, they could see police teams advancing methodically, forcing the organization's members to retreat. The sound of helicopters approached overhead. "Stay here," Wells ordered the children. "When I signal, run straight to that doorway. Don't stop for anything." Jamal wrapped a protective arm around Ellie as they waited. More shots rang out, accompanied by shouts and the sound of breaking glass. The morning mist filled with smoke and chaos. Wells fired several covering shots, then waved urgently. "Now, run!" Jamal and Ellie sprinted across the open space, hearts pounding. Bullets pinged off metal nearby. Ellie stumbled, but Jamal kept her upright, half carrying her the final few steps. They pressed against the building's wall, gasping for breath. Through the door's small window, they could see a figure slumped in a chair inside. Ellie's eyes widened with recognition. "Dad," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The gunfight continued around them as police closed in on the remaining gunmen. But for Ellie, the chaos seemed distant. Her father was just inches away, separated only by a locked door covered in familiar symbols. Symbols he had taught her to read. While the police were engaged in the firefight, Jamal noticed a narrow passage behind some crates. "Ellie," he whispered, "we can get to your dad through there." Detective Wells said to stay here." Ellie hesitated, though her eyes kept darting to the window where she could see her father. "Sometimes being brave means breaking rules," Jamal replied softly. "Show me how to open that door." They crept along the passage, keeping low. The gunfire provided cover for their movements. Ellie studied the lock mechanism, her fingers shaking as she traced the familiar patterns. "Dad taught me this," she whispered. "The symbols aren't just marks, they're instructions." Her small hands moved deliberately, pressing specific points in a sequence. Like a puzzle combination. The lock clicked softly. Jamal eased the door open and they slipped inside. David Harper sat slumped in a chair, his wrists bound. His face was pale and thin, but his eyes lit up at the sight of his daughter. "Ellie," he croaked, disbelief mixing with joy. "My brave girl." Ellie rushed to him while Jamal worked on the ropes. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged her father. "I kept the necklace safe, Dad, just like you said." "I knew you would." Mr. Harper's voice was weak but proud. "You always were good at solving puzzles." As Jamal freed the last rope, Mr. Harper struggled to stand. "We have to hurry," he said urgently. "There's going to be a major exchange tonight. Weapons, drugs, everything. They've been moving across borders." "The police are already here," Jamal explained, supporting Mr. Harper's weight. "They're fighting the bad guys outside." "No," Mr. Harper shook his head weakly. "This is just a small team. The real meeting is happening at their main facility. That's why I left the clues, hoping someone would find them in time." More gunshots rang out nearby. Ellie gripped her father's hand tightly. "We need to get you out of here first," she insisted. "Then we can stop them." Jamal peered out the door, checking their escape route. The passage was still clear, but smoke from the gunfight was getting thicker. They had to move fast if they wanted to get Mr. Harper to safety. The sound of gunfire gradually died down as police teams secured the area. Through the smoke, officers led handcuffed men in suits to waiting vehicles. Detective Wells coordinated with his teams through the radio, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Main building clear," crackled one voice. 6 suspects in custody. "Parking areas secured." came another. 2 more detained. But amidst the chaos of arrests, a black SUV peeled away from the far side of the factory. Officers fired at its tires, but the vehicle disappeared into the forest, carrying several high-ranking members of the organization. "We'll find them," Detective Wells assured Mrs. Johnson, who had rushed from the surveillance van. "The documents from Mr. Harper give us everything we need to track them down." Jamal helped Mr. Harper walk slowly across the yard, Ellie never leaving her father's side. Mrs. Johnson ran to meet them, quickly assessing David Harper's condition. "He needs medical attention," she said firmly. "Now." Paramedics guided Mr. Harper to an ambulance, Ellie climbing in beside him. She held his hand tightly, as if afraid he might disappear again. "You're safe now, sweetheart," Mr. Harper whispered hoarsely. "Both of us are." Jamal watched from beside his mother as the ambulance doors closed. Police cars escorted the vehicle away from the scene, their lights flashing against the morning mist. "You shouldn't have gone in there," Mrs. Johnson scolded Jamal gently. "But I'm proud of what you did." Detective Wells approached them, tucking his radio away. "The escaped leaders won't get far. Every law enforcement agency in 3 states has their descriptions now." He smiled slightly. "Thanks to Mr. Harper's detailed records, we know exactly where to look." As they drove away from the factory, following the ambulance, Ellie finally allowed herself to relax. Her father was alive. The nightmare was ending. Through the window, she watched the forest fade into the distance, along with the darkness that had haunted her for so long. Mrs. Johnson glanced in the rearview mirror at Jamal, who sat quietly processing everything that had happened. Sometimes, she realized, the bravest heroes were not the ones with badges and guns, but those with pure hearts and unwavering friendship. The small hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of medical monitors. David Harper's hands trembled slightly as he began to tell his story, his voice weak but determined. "It started with a simple job," he said, looking at Ellie and Mrs. Johnson. "Just transportation, trucking goods across state lines. The pay was good, better than anything I'd ever seen in construction." Ellie sat close to her father, her hand resting on his arm. Mrs. Johnson listened carefully, her lawyer's mind already piecing together the details. At first, everything seemed normal," David continued. "They'd give me specific routes, tell me exactly what to transport. Sealed containers, no questions asked." He paused, a bitter smile crossing his face. "I was naive. So naive." The first signs came slowly. Strange shipments that didn't match the paperwork, containers with extra thick walls, meetings with men in expensive suits who never quite looked him in the eye. "One night," he whispered, "I saw something I shouldn't have while unloading a shipment in an industrial warehouse near the state border. Packages that weren't just goods. Drugs. Massive quantities of drugs." His world changed in that moment. What had seemed like a straightforward job became something much darker. "I tried to walk away," David said, his voice gaining strength. "But they don't let people walk away, not from an organization like this." A shadow crossed his face. "The threats started immediately. First they called my phone, then they came to our house." Ellie remembered those nights, the hushed phone calls, her father checking and rechecking the locks, the fear that seemed to live in their home. "They said they knew everything about me," David continued. "Where I worked, where Ellie went to school. They made it clear one wrong move and my family would pay the price." Mrs. Johnson leaned forward. "So they forced you to continue working for them?" David nodded. "I became their way of hiding their operations, a seemingly ordinary truck driver who could move shipments without raising suspicion. Each delivery was a performance. Each mile driven was a risk." But David wasn't content to simply comply. He began collecting evidence, quietly, carefully, notes in margins, photographs taken discreetly, tracking the organization's movements. "I knew I had to expose them," he said, "but I also knew I couldn't do it alone, and I couldn't risk Ellie's safety." His hand reached out, touching the necklace Ellie wore, the silver pendant that held more secrets than anyone realized. "That's why I prepared her," David explained. The symbols, the necklace, everything was a message. A way to protect her, a way to leave clues if something happened to me. Ellie's eyes filled with tears. Now she understood. The late-night lessons, the strange games that seemed like puzzles. Her father had been preparing her all along. "I'm sorry," David whispered, pulling his daughter close. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." But Ellie just held on to him, understanding now that every mysterious action had been an act of love, protection, a father's desperate attempt to keep his daughter safe in a world far more dangerous than she could imagine. The story hung in the air, a testament to a father's courage, a daughter's resilience, and a secret that was about to change everything. The silver pendant caught the light, its intricate symbols telling a story far deeper than any words could. David Harper's fingers traced the familiar marks, showing Ellie the hidden meaning he'd carefully encoded. "This symbol," he pointed, "marks their final transaction point, the last big move they were planning." Ellie's eyes widened. What seemed like a simple piece of jewelry was actually a map, a warning, a final piece of evidence against the organization that had hunted her family. Detective Wells leaned forward, his experienced eyes studying every detail. "These markings," he murmured, "they're precise, calculated." Mrs. Johnson understood immediately. "He was protecting us," she said softly, "even when he was in danger." The documents spread across the table told a fragmented story, coded messages, hidden routes, precise observations about the organization's movements. Each page revealed another layer of David Harper's desperate fight to keep his family safe. "Dad knew they would come after us," Ellie whispered, her fingers running over the necklace. "He prepared everything." The police team worked meticulously, cross-referencing David's notes with their existing evidence. Each document was a potential breakthrough, each symbol a key to unraveling a complex criminal network. "We can track their entire operation now," Detective Wells explained. "Your father's documentation is incredibly detailed." Jamal watched in awe. A single necklace, a few carefully hidden documents, and now an entire criminal organization was exposed. Ellie clutched the pendant, understanding now that her father's love was bigger than fear. He had fought, planned, risked everything to protect her, to ensure the truth would eventually come out. "We'll finish what he started," Mrs. Johnson said firmly, looking at Ellie. "Together." The investigation was just beginning, but hope had finally found its way home. Sirens echoed across 3 state lines, wanted posters plastered police stations, airports, and border checkpoints. The organization's leaders had nowhere left to hide. "We've got him," Detective Wells announced, tapping a photo of the primary target. His finger traced the red marker across a map filled with interconnected locations. Every major city is on alert. Within 72 hours, the massive manhunt delivered results. One by one, core members were tracked down. Warehouses were raided. Hidden accounts were frozen. The criminal network that had operated in shadows for years suddenly found itself completely exposed. The leader, a man who'd seemed untouchable, was captured in a small motel near the Canadian border. No dramatic shootout, just quiet, methodical police work built on David Harper's meticulous documentation. "Never a single key member escaped," the police chief told Mrs. Johnson. His voice carried a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal relief. For David Harper, Safety meant a new identity. The Witness Protection Program became his lifeline. A small town, a new name, constant protection, but freedom at last. Ellie's family wasn't just protected, they were given a chance to rebuild. Regular check-ins with federal marshals, a secure home far from their old neighborhood. No more looking over their shoulders. "We're safe now," David told Ellie, squeezing her hand. His eyes, once constantly scanning for threats, now looked peaceful. Jamal visited often. Mrs. Johnson remained their legal guardian, ensuring every protection possible. The necklace, once a potential death sentence, now symbolized hope. The organization was finished. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally arrived. Meadowbrook was nothing like their old city. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, trees that whispered stories instead of sirens blaring. Ellie's hand slipped into her father's as they walked toward her new school. The morning sunlight felt different here, softer, safer, no more looking over their shoulders. "Ready?" David asked, his smile gentle. She nodded, the silver necklace tucked safely beneath her shirt, a reminder of their journey, not a symbol of fear anymore. The first day wasn't easy, new faces, new questions, but Ellie remembered what Jamal had told her. Being brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing things even when you're afraid. Her art teacher noticed something special. The drawings Ellie created weren't just pictures, they were stories, landscapes with hidden symbols, scenes that spoke of survival and hope. "These are remarkable," her teacher said one afternoon. "You have a real talent." Slowly, carefully, Ellie began to trust again. She made friends, joined the school's art club. Her laughter, once a rare sound, became more frequent. David watched her transform, the weight of their past gradually lifting, replaced by something brighter. Hope. Healing. Some nights, they'd sit together. David would tell her stories about their old life, the good memories, not the scary ones. Ellie would draw, her pencil moving across paper like a storyteller reclaiming her narrative. Jamal called weekly, his basketball stories making Ellie giggle. Mrs. Johnson checked in, ensuring they were settling well. "We're okay," David would always say. And for the first time in years, he meant it. The necklace remained close, not as a weapon or a warning, but as a memory, a testament to a father's love and a daughter's courage. A new chapter had begun, and this time they were writing it together. Every weekend, the phone would ring. Jamal's voice, full of energy and warmth, would fill Ellie's Saturday mornings. "You won't believe what happened at basketball practice," he'd start, launching into stories that made Ellie laugh. They weren't just friends anymore, they were family. Sometimes he'd send drawings of basketball plays, other times long text about school. Ellie would reply with her latest artwork, each message a thread connecting their worlds. Mrs. Johnson watched these interactions with a quiet smile. The case that had once consumed her life had transformed into something beautiful, a family saved, a child protected, justice served. "We did it," she sometimes whispered to herself, reviewing the final case files. The organization was completely dismantled. Ellie and her father were safe. David Harper's journey wasn't easy. Years of undercover work and legal testimony had taken their toll, but in Meadowbrook, he found a path to healing. The local hardware store needed a manager. Steady work, no secrets, just honest labor and a chance to rebuild. "I never thought I'd be so happy sorting lumber," he told Ellie one evening, his hands calloused but content. The fear that once haunted his eyes had been replaced by peace. Jamal would visit during school breaks. Basketball in the driveway. Ellie sketching them from the porch. David watching, grateful for this second chance. Mrs. Johnson's law firm occasionally consulted her about the case, but for her the real victory was sitting right in front of her. A family rebuilt, a child healing, hope restored. Some stories, she would tell her colleagues, have the best endings. And in Meadowbrook, under the warm sun, Ellie's story was just beginning. Meadowbrook felt like a painting of peace. Quiet streets lined with maple trees. Houses with white picket fences. No shadows, no fear. Ellie's art studio, a small corner of their cozy living room, became her sanctuary. Watercolors spread across the table, pencils carefully arranged. Her hands moved differently now, confident, free. "Look, Dad," she'd call, holding up a landscape, symbols hidden in tree branches, memories transformed into art. David watched her, his heart full. The hardware store where he worked wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Every day he stacked lumber, helped customers, rebuilt something more than just shelves. He rebuilt trust. "Want to help me organize these paintbrushes?" Ellie asked one afternoon. He smiled. "Looks like you're the artist in the family." Her paintings began winning local competitions, soft watercolors that told stories without words. The art teacher saw something special, not just talent, but resilience. "These aren't just pictures," her teacher said. "These are healing." David's hands, once hidden in shadows, now carried wood and helped customers. His past was a closed chapter. Here he was simply a father, a worker, a man finding peace. Ellie's necklace hung on her easel, no longer a secret weapon, but a memory of survival. Each brushstroke was a celebration of freedom. In Meadowbrook, they weren't running anymore. They were living. The bus would roll into Meadowbrook every few weeks, and out would step Jamal, basketball tucked under his arm and a grin wider than the horizon. "Ellie!" he'd shout, waving. "You won't believe what happened at practice." Stories would pour out over hot chocolate, basketball games, school pranks, city adventures that made Ellie laugh until her sides hurt. Their friendship had survived everything: distance, danger, uncertainty. Mrs. Johnson continued her legal work, but differently now. Not just cases, but causes, families struggling, children needing protection. Each file was personal, each client a potential story of hope. "Sometimes," she'd tell David, "winning isn't about the law, it's about believing in people." Ellie transformed. The scared little girl became something remarkable. Her art told stories of survival. Her smile carried strength. In school, other kids noticed something different about her. A quiet courage that spoke volumes. During art presentations, she'd share carefully crafted pieces, landscapes with hidden symbols, paintings that whispered about resilience. Her classmates would listen, captivated. "My dad taught me," she'd say, "that every challenge is just another part of your story." The necklace remained not a weapon but a memory, a reminder that strength comes in many forms. Meadowbrook watched a young girl bloom, unafraid and unbroken. Sunday afternoons became sacred in the Harper household. Mrs. Johnson would arrive with homemade apple pie. Jamal would bring his latest basketball stories. Their small living room became a sanctuary of reconnection. "Remember when we first met?" Ellie would tease Jamal. Her artwork spread across the coffee table. David watched these moments, his heart both heavy and light. The past wasn't forgotten, but it no longer controlled them. "I made so many mistakes," he'd whisper to Ellie during quiet moments, "but protecting you was never one of them." His hands, once used to navigate dangerous transactions, now carefully framed Ellie's artwork, each painting a testament to their survival. "We survived," he'd tell her. "That's what matters." Jamal would squeeze Ellie's shoulder. Mrs. Johnson would smile, seeing a family rebuilt from fragments of fear. The necklace hung nearby, no longer a secret, but a symbol of a journey, of love stronger than danger, of hope that never dies. In Meadowbrook, they weren't just surviving. They were living, completely, beautifully, unafraid. Basketball wasn't just a game for Jamal anymore. It was a lesson in courage. That winter night when he found Ellie changed everything. One moment of kindness, one decision to help someone scared and alone. He realized true strength wasn't about winning games, but about standing up when nobody else would. Sometimes, he'd tell his teammates, helping one person can change everything. Ellie watched Mrs. Johnson work, fascinated. Legal briefs, case files, the careful pursuit of justice. Her childhood experience had transformed into a calling. "I want to help people like Mrs. Johnson did for me," she told her father. Her eyes shone with determination. No longer the frightened girl, but a future protector of others. Her artwork now included sketches of courtrooms, lawyers defending the vulnerable, symbols of justice hidden in every brushstroke. David would smile, seeing his daughter's transformation, from a child running from danger to someone ready to face it head on. "The best way to heal," Mrs. Johnson once told her, "is to turn your pain into purpose." Ellie understood, and she was ready. The remnants of the organization, though largely captured, left scars that refused to fade. Investigations continued, unearthing hidden branches that had taken root across the country. Detective Wells pored over files late into the night, his desk a mosaic of mugshots and red strings connecting distant crimes. Each arrested member revealed new threads to follow, new shadows to illuminate. In Meadowbrook, a sense of safety settled over the Harper household, but it was a cautious peace. Unmarked police cars patrolled their quiet street, vigilant guardians against any lingering threats. "We're just here to keep us safe," David reassured Ellie, noticing her glance at the patrol car parked discreetly near their driveway. Ellie nodded, her hand instinctively touching the necklace that had once been their lifeline. "I know, Dad, it's just hard to forget everything that happened." He pulled her into a hug, his voice soft. "We don't forget, sweetheart. We heal. And we remember how strong we are." Mrs. Johnson's visits brought updates and reassurances. The legal battles were far from over, but the tide had turned. The organization's power was crumbling under the weight of justice. "This takes time," she explained over dinner one evening. "Dismantling a criminal network this complex is like untangling a spider's web, but we're making progress every day." Jamal listened intently, his young face serious. "And you're sure they can't hurt Ellie anymore?" "They won't get that chance," Mrs. Johnson promised. "Ellie and her father have the full protection of the law enforcement. We won't let anything happen to them." In the quiet moments, David sometimes still startled at unexpected noises, his body remembering the constant state of fear. But slowly, gradually, the peace of Meadowbrook seeped into his bones, replacing the chill of his past. Ellie's artwork flourished, her canvases now filled with light and color. The shadows that had once haunted her dreams receded, replaced by the warm embrace of her new life. And through it all, the love between father and daughter grew stronger, a bond forged in the fires of their shared journey. They had emerged from the darkness together, scarred but unbroken, ready to face whatever the future held. The organization's remnants might still linger, but the Harper story was one of resilience, of hope that could not be extinguished, and with the support of their friends and the protection of the law, they knew they could weather any storm. Miles apart but closer than ever, Jamal and Ellie's friendship thrived. Weekly phone calls turned into daily text messages, each one a lifeline of laughter and support. "You should have seen Coach's face when I made that shot," Jamal chuckled over the phone one evening. I thought his eyebrows were going to fly right off his head." Ellie giggled, her paintbrush dancing across the canvas. "I wish I could have been there to see it." "Next game for sure. I'll save you a front row seat." In the living room, David sat hunched over his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys. The cursor blinked on a blank page, the title Untitled Memoir staring back at him. With a deep breath, he began to write. Words poured out, painful at first, then cathartic. He wrote of his mistakes, his regrets, and ultimately, his unwavering love for his daughter. "Writing this isn't easy," he confessed to Ellie one afternoon, "but I think it's important. If our story can help even one other family, it'll be worth it." Ellie hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You're so brave." In the city, Mrs. Johnson's office buzzed with activity. Her desk overflowed with files, each one representing a family torn apart by the organization's cruel web. "Many of these people were like David," she explained to her paralegal, "caught in a system they couldn't escape, forced to make impossible choices." She worked tirelessly, poring over every detail, determined to secure justice for those who had suffered. Late nights turned into early mornings, but she barely noticed the time. "You're making a real difference," Jamal told her during one of his visits. "Those families are lucky to have you." Mrs. Johnson smiled, exhaustion and pride mingling in her eyes. "I'm just doing what I can. After seeing what Ellie and David went through, I knew I couldn't stand by and watch it happen to others." Back in Meadowbrook, Ellie's art room filled with canvases, vibrant landscapes, intimate portraits, abstract expressions of emotion, each one a piece of her journey. "Your art tells such powerful stories," her teacher marveled. "Have you ever considered a gallery show?" Ellie blushed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You really think people would want to see them?" "I know they would. Your work has a way of touching people's hearts." As the sun set over Meadowbrook, Ellie and David sat on the porch swing, sipping lemonade and watching the fireflies dance in the dusk. "I never thought we'd have this again," David murmured. "Moments of peace, without looking over our shoulders." Ellie leaned her head on his shoulder. "We made it, Dad, together." In that moment, the past felt distant, its shadows fading in the warm glow of their new life. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibilities. And though the scars would always remain, they knew they had the strength to face anything, as long as they had each other. The years flowed by like a gentle river, carrying Ellie from childhood to adulthood. With each passing season, her resolve grew stronger, her commitment to justice unwavering. She stood tall in her graduation gown, her father's proud tears glistening in the sunlight. "You're going to change the world, Ellie," he whispered as he hugged her tightly. Ellie smiled, her heart full. "I learned from the best, Dad. You taught me what it means to be brave, to stand up for what's right." She carried that lesson with her as she started law school, following in the footsteps of Mrs. Johnson and her father. Late nights studying, endless cups of coffee, the weight of textbooks balanced with the weight of her purpose. "It's not easy," she admitted to Jamal over the phone, exhaustion seeping into her voice. "But every time I think about giving up, I remember why I'm doing this. For Dad, for Mrs. Johnson, for every family that's been torn apart by injustice." Jamal's voice was a comforting balm. "You got this, Ellie. You've always been a fighter, and you've got an army of people cheering you on." In Meadowbrook, life continued its gentle rhythm. David's memoir hit the shelves, a testament to the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. It found its way into the hands of those who needed it most, families struggling to hold on to hope. "I never imagined my story could help so many people," David marveled, reading a letter from a reader who found the courage to leave an abusive situation. "It's humbling." Mrs. Johnson's law firm became a beacon for the oppressed, a lighthouse guiding the way to justice. She took on cases that others deemed hopeless, fighting for the voiceless with the same tenacity she'd shown in protecting Ellie. Every victory, every family reunited, every child saved, it's because of you, she told Ellie over dinner one evening. You and your father showed me what true bravery looks like. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ellie found herself sitting on the porch steps, her fingers absently tracing the silver pendant at her throat. The necklace had become a part of her, a constant reminder of the battles she'd fought and the strength she carried within. David joined her, 2 steaming mugs of tea in hand. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight dance across the lawn. "I'm so proud of you, Ellie," David said softly. "Watching you grow into this incredible woman, seeing the difference you're making in the world, it's the greatest gift a father could ask for." Ellie leaned her head on his shoulder, a soft smile playing at her lips. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. Without Mrs. Johnson, without Jamal. We made it through together." The twilight deepened, stars blinking to life in the darkening sky. Ellie's hand closed around the pendant, feeling the weight of its story, the weight of their shared history. "Everything we went through," she murmured. "All the pain, all the fear. It taught me something. It taught me that love is stronger than hate, that hope can survive even the darkest times, and that when we stand together, when we fight for each other, there's nothing we can't overcome." David nodded, his own eyes misty with emotion. "That's the truth, sweetheart. That's the truth." They sat there as the night settled around them, 2 survivors, 2 warriors, bound by a love that had weathered the fiercest storms. The challenges they'd faced had left scars, but they had also forged an unbreakable bond, a family tempered by fire and strengthened by adversity. Ellie looked up at the stars, her heart swelling with gratitude. For her father, for the friends who had become family, for the chance to make a difference in a world that so often seemed shrouded in darkness. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But she also knew that she would never face them alone. Because in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all. Ellie held tight to her necklace, to the promise it represented. A promise to keep fighting, to keep believing, to keep holding on to hope. A promise to honor her father's legacy, to be a light in the darkness. And as the night deepened around them, as the crickets sang their gentle lullaby, Ellie knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, a family, a team, unbreakable. Thank you for watching our video and experiencing the incredible journey of Ellie, David, Jamal, and Mrs. Johnson. We hope their story of resilience, love, and the fight for justice has touched your heart as much as it has ours. If you were inspired by their unwavering spirit and the unbreakable bonds of family, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends and loved ones. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that celebrate the triumph of hope over fear and the extraordinary strength we all carry within us. And please, leave us a comment below. We would love to hear how Ellie and David's story resonated with you and what moments of courage and compassion struck you the most. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us continue to create content that uplifts, inspires, and reminds us of the incredible power of the human heart. Thank you again for being a part of our community, and until next time, keep believing in the strength of love, the importance of family, and the resilience of the human spirit. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.